Long years ago, we made a tryst with destiny, and now the time comes when we shall redeem our pledge. A moment comes, which comes but rarely in history, when we step out from the old to the new. It is fitting that at this solemn moment we take the pledge of dedication to the service of India and her people, and to the still larger cause of humanity.
Hello everyone, and welcome to India Colonized, a podcast dedicated to South Asia's modern and contemporary history. I'm your co-host Ritika Chauhan, and you're listening to Guftagu, a special series where we discuss and engage with varied authors and scholars of South Asian history. In this episode of Guftagu, we have with us Dr. Ghee Bowman, author of the book The Indian Contingent, Forgotten Muslim Soldiers of Dunkirk. Dr. Ghee Bowman is a historian, teacher, and storyteller based in Exeter, England. He has also worked in the theatre, for NGOs, and in education in the United Kingdom and around the world. This book, his very first, sprang from research he undertook to explore Exeter's multicultural history, which landed him onto 3 photos of Indian soldiers wearing pagris in Devon. This furthered him to the National Archives, an MA at Exeter University, and then a PhD. His 5-year-long study of the Second World War's Indian Contingent took him across 5 countries. As the title suggests, the book brings to light an omitted chapter of the historic Battle of Dunkirk, that is, the crucial role played by Indian soldiers in the evacuation of the Allies from a precarious battlefield. The Indian Contingent, through rigorous research and engrossing narration, traces the journey of Force K6 of the 25th Animal Transport Company of the Royal Indian Army Service Corps from their arrival in France on 26 December 1939, the captivity under the Germans, till their return to India on the verge of partition. Interestingly, 2020 marked the 80th anniversary of this dramatic evacuation of around 338,000 Allied troops from Dunkirk in May 1940 as the German army closed in. This wartime legend is also the subject of the award-winning 2017 film Dunkirk. But, as is only too evident from the film and other accounts of the Second World War, the presence of Indian soldiers is neither known nor remembered, at least in the Western world. Bowman's narrative of individual soldiers' lives in rural and urban Punjab, interwoven with his descriptions of the war, draws on his painstaking research that includes rare archives, diaries, photographs, and indeed memories passed on to descendants. The book leads up to the aftermath of the war and the new realities. This interview explores and examines the provided stances in the book along with other broader perspectives of the event. Here's the conversation with Dr. Ghee Bowman.
So, hello and welcome, Dr. Ghee Bowman, to India Colonized, a podcast on India's colonial modern history. We are glad to have you on our podcast. So before we begin to get inside questions about your book, so here are a couple of biographical questions, a format that we usually follow. So tell us a bit about yourself, the intellectual journey you had, and the kind of books and people that have influenced you through this journey.
Thank you for having me on, Omar. It's a pleasure to be here. Well, the intellectual journey I've had is perhaps a little bit unconventional because I finished my PhD 2 years ago, and I am, as you see, I'm not in my 20s. I'm actually just turned 60 a few weeks ago. So my journey has been, rather than being a kind of straightforward journey that follows one line along like that, it's been a kind of jumping around and somersaults and all kinds of different angles sort of journey, which has included working in the theatre for many years, working as a teacher of English, working overseas. I worked in Turkey and I worked in Egypt, and then working for a number of different NGOs in the UK, and then recently coming back to education to do postgraduate study at Exeter University only about 6 or 7 years ago. So it's been, which means that I think I have quite a different approach to academia from some of the people who I've met along in the last few years at Exeter University and at other universities. I think I have I guess I'm more pragmatic, perhaps a bit more down to earth. And certainly as far as history goes, I think I'm a great believer in public history. I'm a great believer in finding ways to communicate difficult, complex stories and ideas, to communicate those with an ordinary audience, with a popular audience who maybe is switched on and intelligent and well informed, but doesn't have the background that an academic audience would have. So I guess that's one of the kind of the principal things I would kind of claim in terms of my intellectual journey, is that I like to tell stories, I like to speak, I like to communicate with people, ordinary human beings, and included within that is an academic audience, but it's a general audience.
Oh, that's wonderful. So if you could tell us about how you started discovering the field, what brought your interest in the field, or how did you switch interest, and what started this project?
Great, yeah. So, I wasn't somebody, 10 years ago, I wasn't someone with a great knowledge in South Asia or interest in South Asia. I went to Nepal 20 years ago, but I had never been to India or Pakistan up until a few years ago. But what happened was I was doing a project here in Exeter. So Exeter is a small city in the southwest of England. And I was working on a project on the multicultural history of this place. So we were tracking people who would come to Exeter from around the world for all sorts of reasons. So to do with empire, or to do with travel, or to do with all sorts of things over 2,000 years. So from the Romans up until now. And we were looking for stories. We were looking for good stories. And you can still find the website of that project. It's a great project. So I came across this book. Here, I'll show you the book. So this is a book called Devon at War, and it covers the whole of the Second World War and what happened in this part of the UK during that time. And in that book, here are 3 photos, and those photos are what started this part of my life journey. Those are the photos that got me interested. Those are the photos that turned me into a historian, if you like. So these are three photos of Indian soldiers in this part of the country, in this part of the southwest England, kind of remote rural area, it says 1940. And they've got mules and they're wearing pagris, and they are here in this kind of rural part of Britain. And I was fascinated by that. And because I knew nothing about, there being any Indian soldiers here during the war. So I followed that up. I went to the National Archives, I found some documents, and I very quickly found that this story was very gripping and interesting and multifaceted, firstly, but also this story was unknown. This story was very largely unheard of. And the fact that these guys had been at Dunkirk made it even more interesting. Dunkirk, which was a part of the Second World War, which is very famous here in the UK, very well known and very talked about and understood, or understood in a certain way anyway, mythologized. But the fact that there were Indian soldiers there, and almost no one knew about it. And so that's what grabbed me. And that journey took me to do a master's, then a PhD, and then to write the book.
That's absolutely wonderful. I recall how you mentioned that in the book about UK's memory, or the West's memory of Dunkirk does not have any idea of Indian soldiers being in it. So, so when you started the book, what was the journey like? The kind of methodology you approached it with, certain limitations that you might have had due to archival or publication issues. Yeah.
So the methodology was, broadly speaking, a double path, really. So archival research and oral history. So the archives, I went to all of the major archives in the UK, the National Archives, the British Library, the Imperial War Museum, and I went to lots of other smaller archives and local libraries and so on. And I went to archives in France and in Germany, and those were all fruitful as well. And I went to India and I went to Pakistan. So I went to the National Archives of India in Delhi, and I tried to get into National Archives in Pakistan, but without really any luck. And the archives were very useful. And the other part of that was newspapers. So there was there's lots of reports about these guys in various newspapers in the UK, in South Asia, and elsewhere around the world. They were really very well covered. Excuse me. And then the second part was the oral history. So the second part was finding people here in the UK who remembered them, who had met them when they were children or when they were teenagers, and interviewing those people. And then also going to Pakistan and looking for relatives. I mean, when I went to Pakistan, which was in 2018, I had a hope that I might actually find one of these soldiers still alive, but I didn't. But I did find children, grandchildren, nephews, nieces, lots and lots of relatives of the soldiers who, in some cases, had some really quite considerable memories and documents. So that was the twin track, really, was of the research. And the issues, the problems that I encountered, well, the big issue was that I wasn't able to get into any archives in Pakistan, and that was a shame. And then also that there are documents that should be, that may still exist, but aren't findable. They're not in any of the archives I looked for. So there are some gaps that I know of some documents that would be really helpful that I have never actually found yet. But having said that, I did find an incredible amount of documents, which were really, really good in giving me a clear picture of the story of these guys, as well as lots of detail about specific things that happened to them and specific incidents in their time in France and in Britain. And so, it was a long detective process, really. I mean, that's what it was. It was about kind of following leads and putting information together and for example, finding the records of their hospital. So they had a particular hospital that was one of their units attached to them in France and in Britain. And I couldn't find the documents, the files about that in the National Archives until I went to a little town in Wales called Crickhowell and found a letter from one officer to another, which had the number of the hospital on it. And when I had that number, then I was able to go back to the National Archive and look up in their catalogue and find the documents that I've been looking for years. It really was like being a detective. Also who's doing a jigsaw puzzle, but it's a jigsaw puzzle where you don't know what the whole picture looks like, and the pieces of the puzzle are scattered across different continents, and quite a few of the pieces are missing. So it was a jigsaw puzzle with a difference. But it was also, that's one of the things that I discovered, was that actually I really enjoy that type of work. I really like finding things and putting them together. And that so that whatever the frustrations of the archival research and the oral history research, whatever the frustrations were, actually it was really rewarding.
That's wonderful, because especially the archives records are not always maintained the right way. Sometimes it's not cataloged. There are some things that just put in a pile up, and no one really know what's there. So people are just looking through bundles and bundles to find nothing. Yeah, that's fascinating, and as you said, rewarding at the end of the day when your work comes together. So, so you did say that there were certain gaps in your archival research. Has there been anything that you've come across since the publication of your book that you think might, if not significantly, but add to the narrative of the work?
Definitely, yeah. I mean, people keep contacting me, which is fantastic. I get emails from people in South Asia, people in Europe, saying, "Oh, do you know about this bit?" And quite often I don't know about that bit. And perhaps the best example was really very recently. I got an email from somebody who told me that his father had been one of these soldiers who was in France. Then he was in Britain. And that he had married an English woman and stayed in Britain, which astounded me, because up until now, I've always thought, and I've always told people, when people ask me the question, did any of them stay in Britain after the war? And I have always said, no, they all went back. 1944, they all went back to India. And then some of them subsequently came back to the UK, but essentially they all had to go to India. But no, that's not true. One of them at least stayed in Britain, and I met the son a couple of weeks ago, and I met the mother who had married him a couple of weeks ago, and it was fantastic. So she was a 16-year-old girl in 1942 in a little town called Ross-on-Wye, which is in the west of England near the Welsh border. And one day she was doing her homework, and her mother said to her, "Look, see that boy over there? He looks lonely. Take him a magazine." So the boy was a 25-year-old Indian soldier, a veterinary trooper attached to the 29th Company, and he was walking along by the side of the river, and she took him a magazine and thought no more about it. 2 weeks later, the soldier was back again, and the mother said, "Look, take him an apple." So she took him an apple, and then they started to become friends. And then he was posted up to Scotland. He came back down again and proposed to her, said, "Can we get married?" And she said yes. And so it went from there. So it was extraordinary, because he managed to get a discharge from the army. So he first of all, they looked at transferring him into the British Army. That wasn't successful. But then he got a discharge from the army, an honourable discharge. He was allowed to leave, and he settled in Britain, and they were together for 47 years until he died in 1990, which was amazing. And if I'd known that story 2 years ago, it would have been in the book. But yeah, there we go. That's
very fascinating.
Yeah.
So I think we can now go into talking a couple of questions about your book. So, what impact do you think will bringing out stories from South Asia's military history, make a difference in the narrative of the war? Because not a lot of people do recognize, or at least in the popular culture, recognize the presence of South Asians, or even, mostly South Asians, participation in the World War, which was magnanimous. It was a lot of troops coming from the subcontinent. So what do you think, what sort of difference does it make in the narrative, and, especially in the narrative of World War II?
That's a great question. And I think that question looks different when you view it from here as when you view it from Punjab or Delhi or Karnataka or wherever. I think it's having made the journey from there to here, maybe you have some sense of that. And I myself, having visited India and Pakistan a little bit, I have some sense of that as well. But I mean, one thing that struck me when I went to India, 2017, I think, I went to Jaipur first of all, and I went and I was trying to get a sense of how India and the people of India looked at the Second World War in general. So I went into a bookshop, a big bookshop with lots of English language books in Jaipur, and I went looking for the World War II books. So when you go into a bookshop in England, Waterstones down the road here in this little city of Exeter, there are probably 1, 2, 3 bookcases of books on World War II. So, each bookcase has got 6 shelves, and each of them, there's hundreds of books on the Second World War there. And that's kind of that's what I expect from a bookshop or from a library or from, any other place. There's loads and loads of books on all sorts of different angles of the war. So I went into this bookshop in Jaipur looking for the bookcase of World War II books, and I didn't find a bookcase of World War II books. I didn't even find a bookshelf of World War II books. I found one book. In fact, I found this book.
That's by Raghu Karnad, I guess. Yeah.
And I found this book, and of course I bought it, and I really enjoyed reading it. It's a great book. But I was astounded. I thought, that's extraordinary. And I noticed that, of course, there were lots of books about partition, about independence, about Gandhi and Nehru and to some extent Jinnah, and the whole process of that. And then I talked to people. I talked to my my Hindi teacher, and I talked to other people I was meeting about the war and about how it was viewed. And one of the things that struck me is that somebody I was talking to, somebody who was, extremely well educated and well informed, and they kind of weren't clear in their mind about the dates of the Second World War. They weren't clear about when it happened, when it started and when it finished. And so I very quickly realized that there is a fundamentally different way of viewing the 20th century in India and in Pakistan from there is here. So instead, in this country, 1939 to 1945 is a very clear period of time that has a particular meaning. And in India, 1947 is a point in time which has a particular meaning, and things are related. It's like a peak, a summit, pinnacle. Things relate to that. It's either before that or it's after that. And the Second World War is just part of the process of before that. It's just part of the process leading up to partition and independence. And the level of knowledge, of engagement, of interest in the Second World War is much smaller than it is in the UK, and that makes perfect sense. It does make perfect sense, but as you say, 2.5 million Indians, men from South Asia, including India and including Pakistan and Bangladesh, 2.5 million men, 11,500 women were part of the armed forces. And then on top of that, enormous effort by people in factories and building roads and all kinds of different ways. One of my other favorite books is this book.
Yasmin Khan.
Yeah. Really good book in terms of giving me a comprehensive understanding of not only India itself, but also the way that it interacted with the rest of the world during that period. Millions of people were profoundly impacted. Millions of people in South Asia were profoundly impacted at that time. And I think that their grandchildren, their great-grandchildren, I don't know how old you are, Anna, but maybe your grandparents were around at that time, or your great-grandparents?
Yeah, my grandparents, yes.
Okay, your grandparents were around at that time. And they were affected by it in some way or another. They were affected by it, and yet people don't necessarily have that knowledge. So when I was in Pakistan interviewing people in Punjab, quite often interviewing people in villages in Punjab, the same villages where their grandfathers had lived, they knew very, very little about the war and very, very little about what their relative had actually done and where they had been. And that really was quite striking. So I'm not saying that the Second World War is necessarily more interesting or more valuable for memory in India and Pakistan, but it's certainly underrepresented. I mean, you could probably say it's overrepresented here in Britain. I think that's probably true. You know, that actually the Second World War has a status still. You know, 75 years after it ended, it still has a status which is out of proportion in some ways to actually what it could be. But
yeah, I agree. So, you know, so there's a region or a school of thought which considers that inclusion of South Asian soldiers in World War II was also a part of a propaganda, was also a part of a larger game. So, what are your views on that?
I think that's true. Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. I think that so the guys that I'm been writing about, you know, Force K6 as they were known, they were mule drivers. They were 4 companies of the Royal Indian Army Service Corps who came with their mules and with their carts and came to the south of France at the end of 1939, and were attached to the British Expeditionary Force, the British Army in France. And they were there for a military purpose, for sure. They were there in order to do supply and transport in difficult circumstances where the motor transport wouldn't work, because the British Army didn't have that skill at the time. So that's an interesting point, that the skill of looking after mules and running mule transport, or animal transport more generally, didn't exist in the British Army in 1939, but it did exist in a very large extent in the Indian Army. So they were there for a military purpose, but right from the beginning, there was also a propaganda purpose. So when they landed in Marseille, they were filmed and they were photographed. And there were reports in the newspapers, not just in Britain, but in India and, you know, in New York. I mean, in the New York Times, there is an article about these guys. You know, in a newspaper in New Zealand, there's an article about these guys. You know, it went across the world, this story. And I can show you, if you like, I can show you some film footage from that time.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, I will. So this I will share my screen. Hopefully this will work. Okay, so this is a bit of film footage from the newsreel. So from the Pathé newsreel that went out, and this is actually as shown in India. So the commentary is by Zede Bukhari, who went on to become who was working for the BBC during the war. After the war, he started Pakistan Radio. So he was a broadcaster and a journalist. And this is Marseille, the end of December 1939, as they unload the ships in France.
Mules. Yeah. Fascinating clip.
It's great. I love that film. It's and there's a whole 10-minute YouTube video of that.
We could definitely link that in the description. Yeah.
Right. And he and his commentary is very amusing as well. He kind of he's a good, you know, he's great at
improvises really well.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's really nice. Yeah, so they were, you know, they were there with always that twin purpose. They were there for a military purpose and they were there for propaganda, no doubt about that.
So what sort of propaganda was it serving?
To say that, you know, we are here together, that the empire is united, that the men from India and the mules from India have come 7,000 miles to help us, and that we stand together. And I guess it depends on, so the message that they were sending in that one is different from the message they were sending in Britain. So they had the same, in Britain they had the same footage with a different voiceover. And in the British version, it's all about, yes, the empire is together and these lucky little men from the other side of the world have come to help us. Whereas there, the message is different for an Indian audience. You know, it's more about that we are needed, and it's also about, to some extent, there's also this so at this time Subhas Chandra Bose was, I think he was under house arrest at the end of 1940 because he escaped in 41, I think. I can't remember exactly when he escaped, but he was, but this idea existed within certain sections of Congress and within certain sections of India that not only was it the war was not something that India wanted to be involved with, but actually, the war was an opportunity for India to make a military struggle in order to find its independence. And as the war went on, clearly, that obviously that took off, particularly with the INA in Burma in the east, but also with what Boers did before that in Europe, which included the recruitment of Indian prisoners of war into the German army, included some of the soldiers from the force cases I've been studying. So, the propaganda message in India, in South Asia, was a different one. But generally, it's a clear message that, the empire stands together, and that we are going to resist the Nazis with the help of India, Canada, Cyprus, Australia, etc.
Yeah. So with all of that propaganda, that dual message being sent, saying it's different in the UK, it's different what's being said in the subcontinent, but also at the same time we have the nationalist movement gaining its peak. Even Gandhi, to quite an extent, has gained a hold in the population of India. So my question, mostly whenever before I used to start pondering about Indian participation in the World War, was always like, what motivated people to participate in the World War, especially in times as such?
Right. So all of the guys you saw in that bit of film were professional soldiers who'd been in the army for at least a few years. In some cases, they'd been in the army for 20 or more years. So quite a few of them were veterans of the First World War. So Major Abbar Khan, for example, who we might talk about later, he'd been in the army since before the First World War. So these were guys who hadn't, and of course later on they were reinforced by men coming out from India who were more, who had joined during the war. But so there's no conscription in India. These were all they didn't have to join the army, although there were economic imperatives. There were things that meant that that their life was economically better and the lives of their families was economically better. And there was the tradition of military service. So these guys were from one of the martial races. So there's this very strong idea that some parts of India and some types of men in India are inherently better warriors. They know how to fight because it's in their blood. And these guys almost all of them were what was called Punjabi Muslimans. So they were Muslims from the north of Punjab, from the Potwar Plateau around Rawalpindi, Jhelum, those kind of areas, and around there. So to some extent Kashmir, to some extent what was then the northwest frontier as well. So they were to some extent following family tradition, or at least local tradition. They were recruited actively in their villages. So the recruiting parties would go out from the British Army, from Rawalpindi, and go around the villages aiming to recruit a certain number of men. And they were earning money to send home to their families. And as I said, quite a few of them were already veterans for quite a long time. So they would probably have served on the northwest frontier already. So they were there. Yeah, they were there because it was, for them, it was a job. It was the job that they signed up to do. Some people called them mercenaries. And I think that's an interesting term. A mercenary being somebody who fights for money for anybody who will pay them. And certainly it's interesting when you think that some of them did join the German army, and what were the motivations there? So I don't think, in most cases, I don't think their motivations were political. I don't think their motivations were much about loyalty to the empire or to the king emperor or to the Raj. They actually, a lot of the men did end up meeting the king, but that kind of was after they had joined the army. So It's much more, I think, about the local feeling in the village and in the household, and what is almost expected of a young man in those villages in the north of Punjab in the 1920s, 1930s.
Yeah, fascinating. So with some economic benefits, as well as the local traditions, is mostly what is. Yeah. So the next question was about if you could explore a little bit about the experience of these soldiers on the front, and especially of those who were taken as prisoners of war.
Right. Their experiences were quite mixed. So I'm going to show you some more photos. So you see that photo, okay?
Yeah.
So this is in 4 months. Yeah, 4 months after they landed. They're in the north. This is the 25th Company. They're in the north of France, in the suburb of the city of Lille, which is a big city right up in the north corner of France, where the British Army was based. And it's a Sunday. And as they had done on several Sundays, they put on a gymkhana. And there are lots. This is from a series of photos taken on that day. And the other photos show men doing trick riding on the back of mules, so standing up on the top of the mule and jumping over things and doing all kinds of sort of acrobatics. And they also show dancing. So there's some guys with a doll and a chimta, and they're playing music. And then there's some guys who are dancing bhangra here in this little village in the north of France. And then this photo shows the audience. So you have the soldiers at the front. Some of them have got children on their laps, little French children. Behind them, you've got the French civilians. There's this wonderful woman in the middle of the picture who's clapping her hands, who's got no teeth. There's a French policeman, a gendarme, and they're having a wonderful time, and they're together. And I think that's sort of something about a really. That's why I like this photo, because it kind of tells this story about them being together, about them being not integrated, but about them having good relationships with civilians in France and then later in Britain as well. They get on with people really well. They get on with kids really well. They form lots of very strong relationships, and some of those relationships are with children. So that's kind of one facet of their experience. I'm just going to skip on to another aspect of their time, which, let me just skip over that one. Okay, this one. So this is an important aspect of their life in France and in Britain, is what they ate. So this is on the right. The photo gives you an indication of their ration. So this is what they were entitled to every day. So 1 pound and 8 ounces of atta, which is 450. It's about 700 grams. So I think that's enough for about 12 chapatis. So they're eating a lot of chapatis every day. So every company is 315 men. Every company has 3 cooks attached to it. And I think one of those guys is basically spending all his day making chapatis. And there's lots of photos of chapatis being made. So they're entitled to chapatis. They're entitled to different types of dal. There's some ghee, meat, 6 ounces of meat. So every day, remember these guys are mostly Muslims, every day each company is slaughtering 6 sheep. So they have a little flock of sheep. Every company has a little flock of sheep attached to it. And they are getting new sheep regularly from local farmers. And every day they're killing 6 sheep and they are making them into curry. And this is a big part of the logistics around supplying these guys. So they have vegetables, they have spices, they have tea, salt and sugar, they have marmite. And most of this is coming from India, in fact. So the meat is obviously local, the vegetables are local, but at least at the beginning of the war, the atta was being sent from India, because there is a difference, so I am told by those who know about flour, there is a difference between the wheat grown in Punjab and the wheat grown in Britain and France. And that difference means that the flour has more gluten in it. And so it's different when you try to make it into bread. So for quite a long time, the flour was coming from India, and the spices were coming from India. And what they found with some of that is that particularly the garlic. So it would take several weeks to come by ship. Longer as the war went on, and the ships had to go around Africa. It would take several weeks for these shipments to arrive in Europe. And by that time, the garlic was not usable any longer. So they had to reduce the amount of garlic they were having. And then as the war went on, so the next picture, so here's the one of the guys making chapatis, two of the guys making chapatis, in fact. And as the war went on, their commander, Lieutenant Colonel Hills, he proposed some changes. So they started to be interested in white bread, so British-style white bread. And that was added to their diet. And then they found a way of making using local flour. It did work. They they had less dal. They added some local pickles and pepper and jam, and the garlic. They skipped the garlic because it wouldn't last the trip from India. And at those days, there was no garlic grown in Britain. It wasn't available in Britain. Nowadays, it's a very common thing. I'm going to probably be planting some garlic myself next week because this is the right time to do it. But in those days, garlic wasn't really grown in the UK. So that's another aspect of their time in Europe. So you asked about the prisoners of war, didn't you? Yeah. So the 22nd Company, they were posted slightly separately from the others, and they were right up in near a city called Metz. And they were near the Maginot Line. So the Maginot Line was this enormously complicated concrete defense along the north and the northeast of France, along the border with Germany, which had been constructed at great expense in the 1930s by the French, specifically to keep the Germans out. And there was a division of the British Army, the 51st Highland Division, was posted around that Maginot Line, and the 22nd Company were attached to them. And when the Germans attacked in May 1940, they became cut off, and they tried to march to Switzerland to get away, but they were captured in the middle of June of 1940, and then they spent 5 years in prisoner of war camps. So they spent the longest period of any Indian soldiers in prisoner of war camps in the war, It's very interesting, their experience. It was quite a mixed experience. So one of their officers was, let me just find you him. So Anis Ahmed Khan. So he was born in 1924. His father was the Vice Chancellor of Aligarh Muslim University. He got his military education at Sandhurst. Born in 1924. Sorry, that's a mistake. He was born in 1904. I made a mistake on there. And he got his military education at Sandhurst, which is the British place where British officers were trained, had been trained for 100 years and more. And he was one of the first Indians to go there to be trained as an officer. And then he was posted to the Madras Pioneers, and then the 1st Punjab Regiment, and then the Royal Indian Army Service Corps. And he's in that photo in the middle of the 3rd row from the back. I don't know if you can see I think that's him there. Can't quite remember. So there he is in that photo. And then a little bit later, so this is him in 1939. This is 1st of September 1939. So the day that the war was declared. Here he is in Delhi with his wife and 4 children. He later there was another one born, whom I met. And he's been in the army for 15 years at this stage. He's risen to the rank of captain. He's kind of getting on well. And he's now a captain in the 22nd Company. Here he is a little bit later. So this is, he wrote a postcard. So this is a photo that his daughter had. This is a photo from 1942, and he wrote a postcard to his cousin. And he was held in a number of different prisoner of war camps. So in Germany, different parts of Germany, he was moved around. And these guys, so there were 300 about 320 of them who were taken prisoner in June of 1940. And then as the war went on, there were more and more Indian prisoners of war in Italy and in Germany and in France, and about 15,000 of them by the end of the war. So he was the first officer. He was the first, and for quite a long time, he was the only Indian officer in German captivity. And therefore, of course, Subhash Chandra Bose was very keen to get him to join the German army. But he refused. He said, what his daughter told me was that he said that he had tasted the king's salt, and therefore, even though he was a nationalist, even though he was, at this time keen on freedom and independence for South Asia, he refused to join the German army, and he spent nearly 5 years in prisoners of war camp, which, I think must have been very tough. I mean, I think if you think about these 320 men, so about 30 of them joined the German army, took a German uniform, and were posted in the Netherlands and then in the southwest of France, and didn't really see much in the way of active service, although some of them did, and then eventually were captured by the Allies again at the end of the war. So 30 of them joined the German army. About 10 of them escaped, and there are some fascinating stories there about those escapes, and how they got to Spain or to Switzerland and different ways that happened. Really fascinating stories. But most of them did what most prisoners of war did, which is they sat and they waited. Now, of course, there's a big difference for Captain Annis because he was an officer, so he didn't have to work. But all of the ordinary soldiers, all of the sergeants and so on downwards, they had to work. So they were required, and this was in the Geneva Convention. So they were working in the fields or maybe in factories. They were doing some work for the local German population. And in that, which was tough, but it meant they were also paid. And then they also got all of them got parcels from the Red Cross. So the Red Cross was responsible for looking after all of the British and Commonwealth prisoners in Germany, and also responsible for looking after all the German prisoners who were here in the UK, and indeed the Italian prisoners who were in quite large numbers in India. So the Red Cross would go and visit the camps regularly, I think twice a year, and they had a man of confidence, as they called them. So every camp there was a man of confidence who was elected by the prisoners to speak directly to the Red Cross representative without there being any Germans present. So they could, they felt there was a kind of way to get their grievances heard, and then there were parcels that came regularly from the UK, which had extra food and cigarettes and so forth. So, but interestingly, one of the interesting things about this is that, obviously the Nazis had very clear ideas about race. The Nazis were inherently racist. I mean, they advertised themselves as being racist. They were proud of being racist. And meant is that, so clearly the French army who experienced ill treatment or in some cases were killed immediately. So there were black soldiers who were treated badly. Russian prisoners of war were treated badly. But generally speaking, Indian prisoners of war were not. They were treated the same as other Commonwealth prisoners. So they were treated the same as Australians or British or South Africans or whatever. Which was meant that they actually were treated a lot better than some of the other prisoners around them. So they survived. The majority of them survived the war in those prisoner of war camps. And then at the end of the war, because there had been so many of them who had joined the German army, they all came to Britain. They were all brought to camps in the east of Britain, east of England, where they were processed and questioned and by British intelligence before eventually being sent back to India. So it was quite, I think being a prisoner of war in Germany was, very, very difficult, particularly towards the end of the war when the rations got very, very, very poor indeed. I mean, all of the camps were undersupplied. There was a lot of hunger in the camps. But it was always better being a prisoner of war in Germany than it was being in a concentration camp. So I guess that's some kind of compensation, perhaps.
Perhaps. So it was fascinating to learn about the concept of namak halali, I have eaten the king's salt. I remember reading one of these works that stresses on the idea of how namak halali and namak harami was a very strong concept that even the British kind of rooted, and they emphasized that the soldiers kept in mind that you have to, namak halali is a concept that you need to stick to. And you've got to be obedient to your masters. And but moving on to talk about one of the major protagonists of the story, Major Akbar Khan. How far does his account help us understand the kind of military developments in British India or colonies as a whole? And also, if you can tell us a bit about the audience, a bit about Major Akbar Khan.
Indeed. So he's a major figure. I mean, he's a fascinating figure. Let me show you a picture of him here. So this is actually a painting that was made. The two paintings were done together. So this was a British war artist by the name of Henry Lamb. He painted these two pictures in 1941 at Hereford, which is in the west of England. The chap on the right is Driver Abdul Ghani, who's young, in his 20s perhaps. We know almost nothing about him. And that portrait is now in a gallery in Glasgow in Scotland. On the left, we have Major Akbar Khan, who's about 50 years old. And that portrait is now in the Imperial War Museum. It's very recently become part of their permanent display there. So he was in the Great War. He was in the First World War, a Jemadar in the cavalry. He was in Mesopotamia, in Iraq, and he was taken prisoner briefly in the First World War. He escaped. And then at the end of the war, in 1919, he became part of the very first group of Indians to be trained as officers. So this idea of Indianization had been around for a long time, and eventually it started after the First World War. So he was trained as an officer in 1919, and then he spent the next 20 years, slowly rising up the ranks until 1939, at the beginning of the war. He was a major. So he was a major in the 25th Company of the Royal Indian Army Service Corps. And he was sent with them to France, and he was there. So the photo that I showed you before of the Gymkhana, he was there on that day, and that was his company. So that was one of the two companies that actually was at Dunkirk. So they left that place in Lille on sort of about the 20th of May 1940, and marched towards the coast and reached Dunkirk on the 28th of May. And he was, in fact, the only Indian officer on the beach at Dunkirk. So that's really quite a considerable badge, if you like, for him. And he was well known. I mean, he was well known in India, and he was also quite well known in Britain already at this time. So he was evacuated in the middle of the night with the men from the beach at Dunkirk, where all this, it must have been a bit like hell, really. I mean, there was the German aeroplanes coming in and bombing and machine gunning. There was an oil refinery which had been set on light, and the smoke was drifting across. There were the boats coming in, little boats coming into the beach, and bigger boats coming into the mole, the quayside, pick up the men, and they were being attacked by the Air Force. And it was hell on a beach. I mean, it was not a good place to be. And he was there, and he marched his men through that hell to the mole, the eastern mole, and they were picked up from there in the middle of the night. And what he wrote in his memoir was that they then got back to England, to Dover in the southeast corner of England, on the next day, the 29th of May, and they were waiting at the station to be taken on to their destination. And there was the women's voluntary service with cups of tea and sandwiches, and the men drank the cups of tea and took the sandwiches and probably looked suspiciously at what was inside the sandwiches, because it might have been ham. I hope it wasn't ham, but it might have been. And then they drank the tea, and then they went to the women and they said, "Can we borrow your trays and can we borrow your pots?" And they borrowed them, and they started to make music, and they started to play music, and they started to dance on the platform at Dover Station on the 29th of May, just back from Dunkirk, covered in dirt and covered in sweat and not having slept properly. And there they are dancing on the platform at Dunkirk, at Dover railway station. And then what Abbar says in his memoir is that the British soldiers and the British civilians joined them, and they're all dancing there on the platform at Dover. I just think that's a fantastic story, and I think, you know, my hope is that someday someone's going to make a film about this. You know, maybe a Bollywood film, or maybe a British film, or maybe a film that's kind of in between the two. You know, but that scene of the dancing on a railway station just needs to be a film. Anyway, so he went on and he spent about a year and a bit in England. He met lots of important people. He met the king. He became good friends with Amory, who was the Secretary of State for India at that stage. And he, in fact, corresponded with Amory for many years after that, and Amory's wife as well. And he stayed with them for about a year, and then he went back to India, and he was doing recruitment, and he was doing various roles because at this stage I think he was a kind of propaganda guy, really. He was, you know, this is a guy that we could use, who was, you know, one of the very first Indians to be in action, who has seen the Germans, you know, who can come back and talk and try and counteract, you know, the kind of the Congress narrative, the Quit India narrative, and try and continue the recruitment process, because of course the recruitment into the army was really important, became increasingly important after 41, after the Japanese entered the war. And at the end of the war, he was a colonel. And then 47, partition, he went to Pakistan, although he had relatives. I mean, he was originally from Punjab, he was from Punjab, but he had relatives all around. But he went to Pakistan, and he was at that stage the highest ranking officer in the Pakistan army. He was, his number was TA1. And he was a major general, but he resigned fairly soon afterwards. He was Jinnah's aide-de-camp as well, but he didn't stay in the army for very long. He retired, and he lived for many, many years in Karachi, and had lots of children and grandchildren, and was really, and I've met one of his daughters, I've met lots of his grandchildren and great-grandchildren. They all remember him with great affection. He was a lovely man, and his family spread out across the globe as well. You can find them in Switzerland, in Britain, in the United States, all around, and in India as well as Pakistan. So he was a great figure, and he is now, as I say, this portrait, you can now find it on display at the Imperial War Museum in London. And it's really, it's good that finally the Imperial War Museum is starting to remember these guys as well.
That's absolutely fascinating. I hope to visit it someday during my stay here. So one of the other things that I really wanted to ask was, South Asians could be one category of people who are not actively recalled in the memory of the World War, even specifically when it comes to Dunkirk. So do we have any other such, communities or nationalities or people or sets of people who have been not brought into the narrative of the World War?
Where do you start? Where do you finish? I mean, it's from a British point of view, the war is seen in a very limited way. I think that's true in most places as well, even by historians. You know, the war is seen as being a number of. So if you go to school in this country, for example, you learn about most thing you learn about is the home front, about the Blitz and about evacuees and about gas masks and that kind of thing. And you learn a little bit about some of the kind of the big battles, which and if you go to school in the United States, you learn about Pearl Harbor and D-Day and the Pacific and maybe North Africa and Italy. But again, it's very limited. And part of that is it's not only about the schools and about the educational process and about historians, but it's also about popular culture. It's also about what comes into the film, what comes into movies and television. So Saving Private Ryan, for example, the film by Steven Spielberg, which I think was about 20 years ago now. I think people's in this country, people in the United States, their vision of what D-Day looked like is completely based around the first bit of that movie. That's it for them. So there's this clear narrative in Britain, in the States, a different narrative in France, a different narrative in Germany, but each of those is limited, is extremely limited. So, for example, probably one of the biggest examples is the fact that the people in Britain don't realize the major effort in defeating the Nazis by the Soviet Union. It was done by the Russians, and they lost about 20 million people during the war, civilians and soldiers, and that actually after the middle of 1941, that was really where the major effort of the Germans was on the Eastern Front. Or China. The fact that for China, the war had already started by 1939 because they'd been fighting the Japanese for several years already, and that conflict was incredibly bloody and terrible and created, was also really central to the Chinese history of the 20th century. So, there's these big kind of stories that are unknown, like that. But then there are all kinds of other. I mean, for example, there was an army from Brazil. The Brazilians sent an army of around 50,000 men that fought on the Allied side in Italy, and was there at some of the important battles in Italy. Almost nobody outside of Brazil knows about that. And then you have these other. Then there are little stories. So I think the story of Force K6 is a little story, which is in some way reflective of the bigger story of South Asia, but it is essentially, it's only a few thousand men. So you've got that story. Then you've got, some stories like my father, who was in radar in the Royal Air Force. There was a detachment or a radar unit that was posted in Turkey, in the west coast of Turkey. And now Turkey was neutral, or at least Turkey was supposedly neutral up until the end of the war. But these RAF guys were in there doing their radar detection of the Greek islands in 1944. So I mean, how many? How many unknown stories are there? And how many can we find? I mean, I think that's within the scope of something as catastrophic and cataclysmic as the Second World War, the Holocaust, 6 million European Jews murdered. Within the scope of that overall enormousness, there are any number of opportunities, if you like, for people to pursue some evil and some villainy of their own in a small local level. And then there are any number of political opportunities as well, how many stories are there not told? Too many stories, too many.
Yeah, but so we do have records, and we do have probably not active memory, but we do have some memory of these participation of other peoples in the World War. But you do mention in the book that the memory of, say, even the Indian participation in the World War was active a few years into the war and after the war as well. But then it declines, and then no one really remembers that part of Indian participation unless it's invoked actively. So what do you think caused that sort of amnesia? And was it because where people started to personalize the experience of the war, and will our understanding I mean, I know probably too many questions in the line. So that personalization of experience, will it change how we see the war, say the same war in 20, 30 years down the lane, when we would have probably completely lost the generation who've experienced the war by them actively or even witnessed the war?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think the personalization of experience is really important, and I mean, I was born in 1961. So there's a phrase that Eric Hobsbawm uses about the twilight zone before you were born, but a period which is sort of in your memory because of family and popular culture. So I feel in some way that the war is almost in my memory because of that, even though it was 16 years before I was born. But nevertheless, I think, firstly, I would say that as a historian, I would encourage everybody to talk to their grandparents and their parents and get their memories, record their memories while they're still around, regardless of, if it's the Second World War or whatever it is, those people lived through interesting times, and you should kind of find out what that was like, so you can put the personal, individual memory alongside the popular memory, alongside the way that historians present it, and you can understand it on a personal level. I think that's important to do. But so your question about the memory that was active, or rather they were known about at the time and then forgotten afterwards, where does that amnesia come from? I think that's a great question, and I think it's really quite difficult to answer, but I think the clues to the answer lie in what happened after the war. So during the war, there was enormous participation from the British Empire. I haven't mentioned, West African and East African troops, for example, who were in Burma in very large amounts. There was participation from Jamaica. Lots of Jamaicans in the Royal Air Force. There were lumberjacks from British Honduras who were in Scotland. All of this crossing, this forced migration across the world. At the time it was recognized, it was part of, it was propagandized, the empires coming together were all fighting for the same purpose. And then, of course, in the case of Force K6, they were actually meeting people on a personal level. There were people, and that's why I've found these great stories about people in these villages in France and Wales and Scotland and England, people who remember them and who fell in love with them. Great stories. So they were known. And they were celebrated, and to some extent, the racism was suspended for the duration of the war. They were kind of accepted in a way that they wouldn't have been beforehand and wouldn't have been afterwards. The end of the war in Britain, there was a general election before the end of the war, in fact, and there was a new government and there was a new spirit in the country. The first Labour government. First Labour majority government, and there was a whole new agenda in the country, which was to do with reconstruction, to do with setting up the National Health Service, to creating a welfare state, nationalising the big industries, and moving away from the empire. So the new Prime Minister Clement Attlee was, he was quite happy to let India move away in a fairly quick period at the end of the war. And so I think there's a refocusing in the public imagination on what we need to do here at home and the physical reconstruction. There were buildings all across the country that had been destroyed, and city centres like Exeter, right here, the city centre was completely destroyed by the German bombers. And there was a lot of that sort of work needed to happen. So I think that's. In this country, I think that's where the amnesia came from, and then it continued from there as the post-war period went on, the 50s and the 60s, and there was this beginning of this mythologizing of certain aspects of the war. So, for example, prisoners of war and the escapes of prisoners of war became very popular subjects for books and films and then TV shows after the war, and there were some great stories and some great films, made about that. North Africa campaign, very much, part of the film part of the armory of British films made after the war, and to some extent Dunkirk, and to some extent the home front. But clearly there's a refocus, and then the amnesia, I think, gets compounded, becomes stronger as it goes on after the war and into the end of the 20th century. And then there comes this process of recognition and re-remembering of contributions from the empire, from South Asia, but also Africa, the Caribbean, and so forth. And that's a process which is much more recent, I think probably a 21st century process. But it's complicated. Memory is a really complicated thing and difficult to understand.
Yeah, but I think it was gaining momentum even in South Asia, where people are looking forward to understand the war, and the Indian participation in the war. I think there is an interest, or maybe I'm just feeling that way because one of the first initial projects that I worked on in my college years was on the Indian participation in the Great War. So I think there is some fascination to it, but even the recent, I don't know how recent, but this movie played by Akshay Kumar and Kesari about these Punjabi Sikh soldiers holding the fort against the Afghan Duranis, kind of sparked conversations about, the Indians serving the British and protecting borders for the English, while India was, struggling to identify itself in the national movement. And a couple of other movies that I guess that's coming up or that have come up. I think another played by Akshay Kumar, The Gold, about the Indian hockey team the Indian hockey team playing for British India in the Olympics.
Is that the 1936 Olympics?
I suppose so.
In Berlin. I didn't know that was. I didn't know they'd made a film about that. I haven't caught up with that yet.
Yeah, I think it's a movie called Gold.
Yeah.
But it revolves around the story of the trainer and the hockey team and how split by partition, the same team found itself divided by partition. So he brings a team to win a gold for India, but then it's split because of partition and the violence, and the Muslims who were together as a team now are finding themselves looking to go to Pakistan, or I don't really remember the plot, but I think that's pretty much the kind of story that it revolves around. So yeah, there is a sort of invocation of such memory, at least that I think in popular media that's going on, and even engagement with colonial history. Quite many of even Dalrymple's work are being turned into movies. I think William Dalrymple's Anarchy is also in midst of being made. But I hope that it does gain momentum, and people do engage a lot in trying to understand. I mean, what I think is a recent past, and gives you a lot of context to assert ideas and opinions and feelings of how we feel about history. Yeah. So this was an absolutely engaging conversation. Before we bring the conversation to an end, a couple of questions that we have. The concluding questions is like, what project are you currently working on, or what projects do our audience or we have to look forward to right now from you?
I'm looking at Indian prisoners of war in Europe. So I'm continuing that strand. So the 15,000 or so Indians, mostly captured in North Africa or Italy, who were imprisoned in Germany, in France, in Italy, and in some cases beyond that, and what happened to them, and specifically one of the escapes. So I'm looking to tell that story. I need to do some. I'm just starting that project. But the research is the next stage.
That's wonderful. And what sort of suggestions would you have for someone who's, not someone always been on the trajectory of being, say, studying history or writing history? Because I, for one, want to actively engage in popular understanding of history. So, what sort of, suggestions would you have for someone who's starting out to engage in popular history, making it more accessible?
Oh, that's a good question. Thank you for that question, Anna. I think I'd say it's good to keep an open mind. Mm-hmm. Try not to make your decision about what happened in the past before you've really seen as much evidence as you can. And secondly, I think I would suggest that you find your sources as wide as possible. So find out, interview your grandparents. Sure, everyone should interview their grandparents, without a doubt. But interview your grandparents and find out what they remember, and record that. And try not to judge them. Try not to, jump in and say, hang on a second, that's not what it says in the history books. Just listen to them talking, and record it record the audio. And also read as widely as you can, but then get into the archives. Archives are great places, and finding those first-hand things, letters and official documents and diaries, finding those things in the archives is just wonderful. And then you can start to put those things together. And then the other bit, of course, if you're doing public history, is that you have to learn to communicate. You have to learn to speak to people, and to learn to speak in ways that they will understand. So that's having an understanding of your audience. And then you have to learn to write, and then you have to learn to use technology as well, and to find different ways to put the stuff across in film or to TV or on the internet or whatever it might be. But if you can't communicate it in a way that people are interested in, then you're never going to be a public historian. And part of that is about stories. Part of that is about acknowledging that people love stories. People respond to stories. They like to hear things that are kind of laid out for them in that, story way. That's my advice.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Bowman. It was wonderful having this conversation with you. Completely enjoyed it. And thank you.
It was my pleasure, my pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone, for tuning into this conversation with Dr. Ghee Bowman. We really hope you enjoyed this. And if you did, please consider subscribing to our channel and podcast for more such amazing content. There's a series of such amazingly curated interactions with authors and scholars on the history of the subcontinent. Check out our website www.indiacolonized.com for more blogs and podcasts exploring the tales of India's contemporary history. Do follow us on our social media sites for more exciting updates. Until next time, stay safe and stay curious.